The cold sting of the night air was still on my skin when I stepped into the hallway and felt it. The wrongness, thick enough to taste. A faint metallic echo drifted up from the basement, like something struggling against the dark. My chest tightened before my mind even formed the fear. If you've ever trusted the wrong person, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. Because moments like this don't come with warnings. They just hit you, fast and brutal, and leave you questioning every choice that led you there. I remember standing at the top of those stairs, one hand trembling on the railing, my breath catching as that sound rose again. I had no idea then what it would cost me. Let me show you how it all began. By the time I pulled into the driveway, it was already past midnight, and something in the air felt wrong. The house had that strange stillness that makes your skin tighten, the kind that tells you something is out of place even before you know what it is. I remember stepping inside and feeling the silence stretch too far, like the walls were holding their breath. I called out softly for Tom, more out of habit than anything else, but the sound barely left my throat before I heard it. Faint, uneven pounding from somewhere below. At first, I tried to convince myself it was the water heater or the vent system, anything ordinary, anything harmless. But the noise kept coming, thin and desperate. When I reached the basement door, I found the deadbolt locked from the outside. That was the moment my stomach dropped. Tom never locked it, and certainly not like that. My hands shook as I forced the lock loose. When the door finally gave way, the cold air rushed up around me. I rushed down the stairs and froze halfway, because Tom was there on the concrete floor, barely conscious. His face gray with fear and exhaustion. His wrists were raw. His breathing was shallow. For a heartbeat, I couldn't move, because the only thing louder than my pulse was the truth settling in. Someone had put him down there on purpose. I didn't know then how any of it had started, or how everything would collapse. Looking back now, it almost hurts to remember how normal everything felt before all of this began. Our life wasn't perfect, but it was steady in the way that feels safe. Tom and I had our routines, our quiet rituals at the end of long days. And Jenna, even though she was 19 and testing boundaries like any teenager, still laughed with us over late dinners and asked for my opinion on little things that mattered only to her. I held on to those moments without realizing how quickly they were slipping away. Everything shifted the day she brought Cole home. I remember opening the door and seeing him standing behind her. Tall, polite, overly warm in a way that made me pause for a second. At the time, I brushed it off, telling myself I was just being protective. But something about him put my nerves on edge. Too eager to please, too quick to make himself comfortable in our space. Even then, Jenna seemed different around him. Nervous, almost jumpy, but so determined to show that she was grown and independent. Over the next few weeks, small things began to pile up. Jenna stopped joining us for dinner. She kept her phone close, silencing it whenever we were around. When I asked if everything was okay, she would smile as if the question itself was unreasonable. I tried to convince myself it was just the normal growing pains of parenting a young adult, but deep down, I felt something shifting, something I didn't want to name. There were warning signs, scattered like breadcrumbs, and I missed every one of them. I didn't understand then how far things had already gone, or how distance would make everything worse. That part of the story began the moment I packed my suitcase for the work trip. I left for Seattle early that Monday morning with a sense of pride I hadn't felt in years. It was the first time my company had asked me to present at a national conference, and I remember sitting on the plane feeling almost weightless, like the world was opening a little wider for me. The week was full of bright rooms, steady applause, and long conversations with people who valued the work I'd poured myself into. For a while, I let myself believe life was finally settling into something good. But even in that high, I kept reaching for my phone, waiting for updates from home. Tom usually checked in without me asking. Yet this time, his messages were short, scattered, almost distracted. I told myself he was just busy with work or tired from the long hours he'd been pulling. Still, a quiet discomfort lingered in the back of my mind. Jenna, on the other hand, sounded unusually excited. She kept telling me she and Cole were putting together a small surprise project for me in the basement, something to make the house feel warmer after I got back. I remember smiling when she said it, imagining fresh paint, or maybe some shelves she'd been wanting to build. I didn't realize then how carefully that explanation was crafted, how perfectly it covered the sounds I might have questioned if I'd been home. Looking back, the red flags were everywhere. The shift in Tom's tone, Jenna's forced cheerfulness, the way she avoided video calls. I wanted to believe everything was fine. So I did. I stayed focused on my presentations, unaware of how quickly danger was closing in around my family. If I had paid closer attention, maybe I would have sensed the truth waiting for me in that basement. When I reached Tom, his body felt almost weightless, the way a person does when exhaustion has hollowed them out. I slipped my arm under his and helped him up the stairs one slow step at a time, feeling how his legs trembled with every movement. The air outside the basement felt warmer, gentler, but it didn't soften the truth settling in my chest. He had been down there for days. I could hear it in the rasp of his breathing, see it in the unfocused glaze of his eyes. When he tried to speak, the words came out in broken pieces, fragments about being tricked, about someone coming up behind him, about the panic of waking up in the dark. I wanted to ask questions, to understand everything at once, but I knew he needed water and rest before anything else. I settled him on the couch, wrapped a blanket around him, and for a moment just watched his chest rise and fall, reminding myself he was alive. Then I turned back toward the basement, because something inside me needed to face whatever waited down there. The smell hit me first, sharp and chemical. When I switched on the light, my stomach twisted. In the center of the room was a shallow pit carved into the concrete floor, just big enough for a body. Bags of lime were stacked neatly beside it. Tarps were spread out with a precision that made my skin crawl. This wasn't panic or impulse. This was planning. Careful, deliberate planning. And then the worst realization of all settled over me. Jenna had known. Maybe not every detail, maybe not the final plan, but she had been part of whatever led to this. The truth was bigger, darker, more organized than I had imagined. And I was only beginning to understand how far it reached. I knew I couldn't just sit in the house waiting for answers. The image of that pit in the basement kept replaying in my mind, and every time it did, something inside me hardened. If I was going to keep Tom safe, I needed to understand who Cole really was and how far this went. So later that morning, while Tom slept on the couch, I drove to Cole's apartment with a kind of numb determination, the kind that comes when fear burns off and turns into purpose. His building was quiet, the kind of place where people mind their own business. I slipped inside, heart pounding, every sense sharpened. The moment I stepped into his apartment, a chill ran through me. It was too tidy, too staged, as if he lived his life on the surface and hid everything that mattered underneath it. I started opening drawers, looking for anything, receipts, notes, something small that could explain what he had done. In the bedroom closet, I found a box tucked behind a stack of old jackets. Inside were notebooks, each one filled with neat handwriting. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Pages of observations about families, patterns of behavior, entries that read like studies. Then I saw dates, photographs, outlines of plans marked with unsettling precision. My stomach dropped when I reached the section about us. Timelines of my trips, Jenna's vulnerabilities, Tom's routines. It was all mapped out months in advance. That was when the truth hit me. Cole wasn't acting alone. This was part of something organized, something practiced. My hands were still on the pages when I heard the front door unlock. I barely had time to slip into the closet, pulling the door closed just enough to see through the sliver of light. Cole's voice drifted in first, calm, confident, unhurried. Jenna's followed, strained and unsteady, and hearing her like that nearly shattered me. They talked about finishing what they had started, about timing, about making sure nothing got traced back. I pressed a hand over my mouth to keep from making a sound, every muscle in my body trembling. I knew then my next move would decide whether any of us made it out alive. The moment their voices drifted deeper into the apartment, I knew I had seconds to move. My whole body felt electrified with fear, but something colder, sharper, took over. I eased the closet door open and slipped out, careful not to let the floor creak. Their footsteps shifted toward the kitchen, giving me the opening I needed. I moved toward the front door, forcing each breath to stay quiet, steady. When I finally stepped into the hallway and pulled the door closed behind me, it felt like breaking the surface after being underwater too long. As soon as I cleared the stairwell, I heard the words that nearly stopped my heart. Cole telling Jenna they needed to finish things before morning. That was all I needed to hear. Tom wasn't just in danger. He was running out of time. I sprinted to my car, dialing him with shaking hands. When he finally answered, his voice was thick with confusion. But I didn't waste a second. I told him to get out of the house, to run, to not stop for anything. I heard noise in the background, heavy footsteps, a door, something breaking, and then the line went dead. Those few seconds were the longest of my life. When he called back, breathless, telling me he'd made it into the neighbor's yard, I nearly collapsed with relief. But relief didn't last. I needed help. Real help. I called Detective Harris, someone I trusted more than most. At first, he sounded skeptical, almost careful, until he stepped into my basement and saw the lime, the pit, the tarps. I watched the disbelief drain from his face, replaced by a steady, urgent focus. He told me this wasn't over, not by a long shot, and deep down, I knew he was right. We were only beginning to understand who we were really up against. When Detective Harris started sorting through the evidence I'd taken from Cole's apartment, I felt myself drifting between numbness and a sick kind of clarity. At first, it all looked disconnected. Receipts, notebooks, photographs, scraps of paper with dates and initials. But as he laid everything out across our dining table, a pattern started forming right in front of me, one so calculated it made my skin crawl. It wasn't just us. There were other families, dozens of them. Notes about inheritances, strained marriages, vulnerable teenagers, medical issues, anything that could be exploited. Each family had its own section, its own timeline, its own strategy. I kept waiting for it to stop making sense, for it to turn into some bizarre coincidence. But it didn't. It fell together too cleanly, like pieces of a puzzle I wished I had never touched. And then I saw Jenna's name, not scribbled carelessly, not incidental, planned. She wasn't just a girlfriend he happened to meet. She was a target he'd chosen, someone he'd studied long before he ever walked through my door. That realization hit me harder than anything else. The anger that rose in me wasn't loud. It was cold, steady, the kind that settles deep in your bones. It told me Cole had done this before. Maybe many times. It told me Jenna had been manipulated long before she understood what was happening. It told me our family wasn't unlucky. We were marked. Detective Harris leaned over the table and pointed out similar cases in other states. Situations that had never been fully solved but followed the same blueprint. Money transfers, sudden disappearances, young adults wrapped around someone older, someone predatory. He spoke quietly, almost reluctantly, as the scale of it came into focus. This wasn't a one-man operation. It was a network, organized, methodical, and expanding. For a long moment I just stood there, staring at the notebook with Jenna's name on it. Horror, disbelief, fury, and then something else resolve. I wasn't going to let this consume her, or us. The next step was the hardest one. I had to face my daughter. I remember standing outside the small interview room, my hand on the cold metal handle, trying to steady my breathing. I thought I was prepared, but the moment I stepped inside and saw Jenna curled into herself, everything inside me cracked. She looked smaller than I remembered, hollowed out by fear and guilt. And for a second, all I saw was the little girl who used to run into my arms after school. But then the weight of what had happened rushed back in, sharp and undeniable. I sat across from her, and the silence between us felt thick enough to choke on. My mind spun through every memory, searching for the moment I had missed this turning. She couldn't look at me at first. Her shoulders shook, and when she finally lifted her face, I saw the truth written there before she said a word. In that trembling breath, she confessed everything. Not with neat sentences or clear explanations, but with broken pieces of fear and shame that tumbled out in fragments I had to piece together. She spoke about how Cole had singled her out, how he fed her attention when she felt invisible, how he twisted love into loyalty, and loyalty into obedience. She told me she had been afraid to resist, afraid of what he would do to her, to us, listening to her hurt in ways I didn't know were possible. I felt anger burning deep, grief tearing at every part of me, and yet beneath all of it was a fragile instinct to pull her close and protect what was left of her. I hated what she had done, but I could see she hadn't acted out of malice. She had been consumed, manipulated, reshaped by someone who knew exactly how to break her. By the time she whispered that she didn't know how to fix any of it, I realized I had to make a choice. I couldn't shield her from consequences, but I also couldn't abandon her to the wreckage he'd created. I reached for her hand, knowing the road ahead would be long, brutal, and public. And that was the moment I understood the fight wasn't over. It was only shifting into the aftermath, into justice, into whatever healing we could still salvage. The hours after confronting Jenna felt blurred, as if my mind could only process one emotion at a time. But when Detective Harris stepped back in and told me they had enough to move, everything snapped into focus. Cole was arrested later that night. Hearing that news felt strange. No triumph, no relief. Just a deep, exhausted breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Jenna agreed to cooperate fully. Watching her walk into the station with trembling hands was one of the hardest moments of my life. She faced legal consequences, yes, but the court recognized her age, her manipulation, and the pressure she had been under. She was placed in a structured program with mandatory therapy, and for the first time in months, I saw a spark of the girl I knew slowly returning. Tom healed slowly too. His body recovered faster than his spirit, and there were mornings when I found him sitting quietly at the kitchen table, staring at nothing, working through memories I couldn't touch. We went to counseling together, individually and as a family. Some sessions left us drained, others stitched tiny pieces of us back together. As for me, I learned that healing doesn't arrive in one sweeping moment. It comes in small choices, a conversation, a boundary, a breath taken before fear spirals. I still walk past the basement door with a tightness in my chest. But I also feel a growing strength in knowing we survived something designed to destroy us. We are rebuilding, carefully, honestly, and with the understanding that trust is something earned over time. Jenna is learning who she is outside of someone else's control. Tom is reclaiming his sense of safety, and I am choosing, every day, to believe our family can move forward. If you've lived through something that reshaped your life, your trust, or your family, I hope you'll share your experience below. Your story might be the light someone else needs. There are moments in life that divide everything into a before and an after. For me, this ordeal did exactly that. It forced me to look at my own instincts, the quiet warnings I brushed aside, and the strength I didn't know I had until I needed it. It taught me that danger doesn't always arrive in a dramatic flash. Sometimes it grows slowly, in the spaces where we feel safest. I've learned that healing isn't about pretending nothing happened. It's about facing what did happen with honesty, patience, and a willingness to rebuild even when you're exhausted. My family is still healing, and so am I. But we're moving forward with clearer eyes and a deeper understanding of what it means to protect one another. If there is anything I hope you take from my story, it's this: trust your intuition. Ask the hard questions, and hold close the people who choose honesty and accountability, even when it's painful. Thank you for listening to something so personal. If you've ever lived through a moment that changed the way you see trust, family, or yourself, I hope you'll share it in the comments. Your voice might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.